Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of Unpublic. This is the 41st episode of Unpublic, and today is a solo show like we have had before. I don't have a guest today. I do have a topic that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and it's something that I rarely ever talk about. So I thought that maybe I would try something a little different today. So today I want to talk a little bit about the invisibility of multiracial students in schools, in public schools. And you might wonder, why is it that I want to talk about the invisibility of multiracial students in public schools? Well, I mean, it's a issue that hits close to home for the very clear reason that my children are multiracial children, and I'm an education activist, and I don't often talk about this. The activism that I do within education comes specifically from the fact that I'm a dad, that I'm a father. I've had to work with, the schools in one way or another for several decades now, and I think that's a good place to start. So this is kind of a personal conversation between me and you, just something I've never really talked much about, and something I'd be interested in hearing your feedback on. So if you're in the comments, go ahead and talk to me. Send me any links, any studies, any suggestions, any thoughts, anything that doesn't make sense about what I'm about to say. So I think the best place to start for me to broach this issue. So first of all, I'm a Creole person. I am from Louisiana. I have lived in multiple places, but my family, on both sides of my family, traces its roots back to Louisiana, back to New Orleans specifically, but New Orleans or Louisiana more broadly. We are a range of shades and hues of people. We are mostly the main stock of my family are Creoles, and proud so to be Creoles. But the way that many people in my family handle their Creolization is, in some cases, they embrace it. They see us being Creole as a people that have a food, a culture, a language. And if you don't think that Creole people have a language, I could definitely introduce you to family members that as they talk, you might have to slow them down to understand what they're saying. All the way to another group in the family that actually deny the Creolization and look for a monoracial identity of Black, specifically Black. Maybe a few people what we call passé blanc, which are the folks that can pass for white. So a range of people in my own family. But I leave the South and I have children, right? And none of this is in my head. I'm not thinking about any of this as I become a father, as I become a parent, as I start interacting with the schools. But if we go back in time, if we go back to the 90s is when I became a parent and I was young. When we went to enroll my firstborn into kindergarten was the first sign that there was an issue that I knew nothing about with public schools. So on kindergarten enrollment day, you fill out all the papers and there's a section for the race of your child. My child was multiracial, had multiracial parents. So clearly we're looking for a multiracial option and there isn't one. So no biggie. We just figure you can check whatever you want to check. Meaning, you check all that apply. And little do we know that at the time there was there is no all that apply. You choose one. It was a monoracial form. And that form meant you can only choose one. Now, I was incredulous. I thought this was the craziest thing that I ever heard. I was like, how can a government agency demand that you identify yourself as something that you aren't fully, as a way to access a public service? That was like that was my problem in my mind. I could not get my head around it. So let me get this right. To be a kindergartner in your schools, we have to identify monoracially, even if you can look at our family and look at the parents and look at the grandparents and whatnot and see that that's not true. That is the cost of enrolling in your public service. So here's what happens. We just flat out deny to check anything then. And that's you're right. You could do that. You can not check anything and still enroll your child like we did into school. But here's what happens after you do that. After you do that, the principals in the schools are given a list of students whose parents have not checked the racial box. And they take that list and they go and find the students individually and they look them in the face and then they check for you based upon what they think you are, like the closest that they can come up with. So they make the check. So my firstborn ended up being more than one thing on different years with different principals, just for a couple of years. And I can't remember exactly how it turned out, but quite possibly it was like Hispanic one year and Black another year, and then I think it was third grade, which was the first testing grade year. He was identified as Caucasian, as white. And I remember like sitting with the teacher and bringing this up and saying, how could this be? Like, look at me, like I might have some sense of ambiguity. I don't think so, but maybe I do. But it's clear that it's not possible that my child is like, straight up white. And I thought it was real weird that it happened in the first year of testing grade and that he was, testing, in the top percentile, right, of test takers. So I just thought it was really weird. Anyways, to expedite the story, I never really thought about this as being an issue in parenting. There were so many issues when parenting came up to me that that as a young parent, I didn't even think were going to be an issue, and this was one of them. And as it became an issue, it made me think deeper just about the identity development of my child. I had to have, like, I think, an extra amount of parental. There was an additional level of complexity to what I was going to need to do as a parent than if I had a monoracial identity and I was raising children with monoracial identities. And I hadn't really thought about it up until then, but I have always had this strong streak of I define me, you don't define me. I wanted for my kids, you define you. You don't let other people define you. You define yourself on what your information, your available information about yourself, your history, your family, your heritage. And I can remember, even myself as a young child, not young, probably teens, my grandmother saying something to me about like never letting people call you mulatto, right? Like that was a term that I had never heard until I had left the South and went other places and people would talk about mulattoes. I remember my grandmother she's proud Creole. She never let us even think about that way of thinking. So with my own kids, I was not going to let that happen either. It was going to be like part of the protection of their identity, part of the protection of them as people, as growing people, was that I was going to protect their identity formation, and it was going to be natural to who they were. And I wasn't going to put them in places and spaces where people were going to expect that they would conform to one monoracial identity or not. Now, I'm sure if we had this conversation, you and I are talking right now, and depending on where you're located in the country or what your own family situation is or what you've probably seen and heard a lot of the stereotypical multiracial identity problems, the tragic mulatto, the kids grow up mixed up and they don't understand who they really are. And in some families, when you had multiracial families, biracial couples, the family would worry, oh my God, what's going to happen to the kids? The kids are going to be so mixed up. They're going to be so all these, negative things. The problem with that is, number one, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People want you to be tragically misunderstood. They want you to be mixed up. You are a threat in many ways. Oftentimes, a multiracial identity is in many ways a threat to the natural order of things. And I don't know any other way to describe it except for you collect heat from both sides. I'll give you a little insight on that. So when I had this problem with the schools, with their categorizing of my child, I actually went to the NAACP, and their response was the NAACP was actively at the time, and I wouldn't have known this and didn't know this, they were actively fighting the addition of a multiracial category. And it was just explained to me very clearly that they thought it would diminish the number of Black identity students, which would diminish their position within the apparatus. Very hard for me to understand. I didn't really, like, I thought, like, this is wrong, it's unjust. And I found that who would be my natural partners on this, someone like the civil rights organization most known for integration and for racial justice, just was not interested. So in I don't know what year it would have been, 95, 96, maybe in there, the year that I was going through all of this, 73% of public schools nationally were using the choose only one instruction for how you fill out these forms. And different states had different levels of participating. So for instance, in California, they had a box for Filipino. They had like 8, 9, 10 boxes. In Minnesota, where I lived, they had 4. If I remember right, it was 4, maybe 5. And so it was up to the state to decide whether or not you could do anything about it. I actually ended up getting an attorney. Paul Wellstone's office actually eventually took up because I was his constituent, took up the case, and they investigated where did this come from, and it ended up it was part of the OMB instructions and guidelines to states where it was located. And he said, well, don't worry, because it's going to be changing in 2000. So for the 2000 census, that was the first time where multiracial people were being counted. And in the schools, some states chose to give you that option now to enlist as to identify yourself as multiracial. So I thought, oh wow, this is progress here now. This is change now. A couple of things to tell you about that timeline though. Like in 2000, Alabama, you should check this out. You should Google this. Alabama was the last state to get rid of their anti-interracial marriage ban in 2000, even though it had been unconstitutional for years. It was still on their law books, and they would go to the public and vote on it, have the public vote on it, and the public literally voted to keep an anti-interracial marriage ban on the books. Couple of societies, couple of groups like the Confederate Society and others fought. And even when they overturned it publicly in 2000, 41% of people still voted to keep interracial marriage illegal. So that should tell you something a little bit about the context of the world. As much as we think we're making this super fast progress on things like multiracial identities, multiracial children, multiracial families. And we are, I think, making progress if you see the numbers of people as progress. That is happening. We are still not where we need to be in things, in settings like institutions like schools. Because just because you start now allowing people to check the box and to say, identify as multiracial, then it opens up the question of what do you do with that information once you have it now? Now, any of you who are watching this, and I see Toya's here with me this morning, Michelle Johnson, Robert Ruiz, Beth Jackson, Sherry Lucas Hall, and so on. Have any of you ever heard any school district or schools, or even in our discussions about education, anybody taking that data about the number of multiracial students and using it to start creating a statistical picture of who they are, how they're doing, where there are gaps, whether or not they're performing really high or really low, whether they have higher incidence of depression or suicide or bullying? Have you seen us talk about that data the way that we talk about other student populations? So we talk about student discipline, and we talk about the teaching, the pedagogy, and all of that stuff, the representation within books or anything. Do you ever see us talk about that through the lens of, are we actually seeing the population of multiracial students within our schools? For me, it's kind of I don't know how to put it. I was about to say, for me, it's kind of a no-brainer that we should be doing it, but for many people, it's a non-issue. There's a lot of people who actually, if you are a monoracial identifying person, there is an instinct. There's a couple of instincts that we should probably just put on the table. Let's just be honest with each other. One instinct is to say, I just really don't see it as an issue. Well, it's not you. So, of course, you don't see it as an issue. You're not somebody whose identity is being challenged on a daily basis to the point where it ends up being a shower of microaggressions, either through invisibility, or you just never see yourself in the coursework that you do, or you have people on one side say you're not enough of this, or you're not enough of that. These are things that actually you're processing as a multiracial person on a fairly regular basis. Now, if you don't care about multiracial people, then that's fine. If you don't care about the fact that these are children, they are creating their identities the way that everybody else is, except for theirs isn't being affirmed in the institutions that we put them into to affirm young people, then you have to see the problem. There's this other instinct, and I should tell this story. This is story number 2. You know, I like to tell stories. So I'm interacting with a few college students who I'm working on a project with. We're talking about everything in the world, and they're introducing me to the idea of pronouns. The people who want to self define what their pronouns will be, and then they kindly ask or suggest that you use their pronouns because it fits the identity with which they most identify with, right? Which, because I'm this person who's so into like the power of identity, I believe your identity is your identity, and you get to construct it, and you get to construct it however you want. I wrote a paper not long ago about some of my childhood kind of music idols, you know, people like Prince and Michael Jackson and Grace Jones and Rick James, and these folks that just broke all kinds of barriers in terms of what it meant to be male, or what it meant to be black, white, what it meant to be, you know, just people who transcended boundaries to create their identity, and you were going to have to live with it. They didn't care what you thought about it. Rick James was going to be Rick James, right? He's going to have long hair, long braids as a, you know, tall black man, and you were just going to live with it. And that, to me, has always stuck with me. People get to be who they want to be. You don't get to tell people who they are. So in this conversation I'm having with these folks who are teaching me about pronouns, I'm very open to it. And the conversation does swing around to my kids that are multiracial. And I don't know how it came up, but I'm basically saying in that moment that as a parent who identifies as Black, Creole, but Black, and who grew up Black and grew up with a Black identity and with Black parents who identified as Black, I'm realizing that with my kids, their story and their identity has an additional layer that I didn't have. So I'm having to parent as the parent who grew up Black, who is raising multiracial children, who's allowing them to decide what their identity is going to be, and providing them the space to create that identity. And the response I got from these folks that were educating me on the pronouns was, yeah, but I mean, isn't the world just going to consider them Black? I mean, it's kind of like the one drop rule, right? Like, and please tell me, y'all watching this, that y'all know what the one drop rule is. But, you know, with the one drop rule, basically, if you have a drop of Black blood, you're Black, right? So isn't society just going to call them Black? So why would you not just go with that? It's a weird kind of statement to make. A couple reasons it's weird. So here's the first reason it's really weird is because it's not true, right? Like, first of all, I don't like the term just Black. First of all, Black is enough in itself. So I don't like the term, well, they're just going to call you Black anyway, so you must be Black. No. First of all, I don't like just Black. I like Black. And 2, if you are Black and you identify as Black, then you are Black. You know, well, okay, let me take that back. Not everybody gets to just identify as Black if they want to be Black, right? I mean, if you have Black heritage and you identify as Black, that's on you. You get to do that, right? So 2, just like that principal who is looking in the face of your kid, I don't think I added this part. In one of those years, the principal asked my son who he thought he was most like, his mom or his dad, as part of making the determination of what he was going to check for us on the box. So you were literally asking a child, which one of your parents do you like love more or identify with more or whatnot? I was incredulous about that. But anyway, so my pronoun folks were saying to me, like, you know, the world is just gonna, you might as well just go with what the world is gonna call you anyways, and they're just gonna call you Black. That's really not true, number one, because depending on what you look like, there are a lot of passing white, there's a lot of passing Black, there's a lot of like, there's lots of elements that you never know what you're gonna get with multiracial and biracial children. But I thought it was so weird for a group of people who had just educated me on people being able to use whatever pronouns they wanted and being able to identify with the gender that they feel most gendered to, who still had a problem with, who still didn't understand that multiracial people are a category of people that that have an identity that should be respected. Now, I'm not telling the story to dog on them. I'm just saying that's kind of a prevalent attitude. And here's my problem with it. I think I already said what my problem with it, but I want to restate it again. In schools, if you don't measure it, if there's no data around it, it doesn't exist. People can not exist depending on, we went through a large battle for years about disaggregating data because we used to combine all the data together. And we used to talk in terms of averages. And the averages hid what was happening with other subgroups, populations. So we started disaggregating the data specifically so that we could have more insight into what was happening with very specific student populations. And where I started in talking about this earlier, I asked you the question, have you seen that level of sophisticated use of data used to illustrate the existence of multiracial people in public schools? And the truth is, I'm waiting for it, and it hasn't happened. Now, in my own situation, I just want to be clear about this. I told you what was happening with my firstborn, but I have children still in the pipeline now, and I can say that things have changed over time. We still have lots of what I consider to be messy, garbage conversations about multiracial people in the general public. For instance, the whole thing with Meghan Markle and the royal family. You know, we have multiracial people who really we don't even think about their multiraciality, their biraciality. People like Lenny Kravitz and Tiger Woods and Barack Obama. Barack Obama was largely seen as a monoracial identity, and he's fine with that, and everybody's fine with that. So we take it. We had our first Black president, all of that. So there are the ways in which it's more, I think, acceptable now as a category of people, as long as you talk about it in ways that everybody's still comfortable. But we do still have these messy conversations. We're talking a lot about light skin privilege these days, where the Meghan Markle thing, I think, opened up a lot of doors for the fears of white people when they think that they're going to have a biracial child or a multiracial child. And the story could go on and on. There were some issues, I think, with Tiger Woods. I can't remember exactly what they were. Maybe one of you guys in the comments do. But I believe that there was some stuff around him, you know, identifying as Caucasian or something like that, and him basically just saying he was going to embrace all his identities. And there were folks that had an issue with it. But we're still not there. I just want to put it this way. That's my bottom line here, is even as we have in popular culture have seen way more kind of racial crossover, even cultural crossover, white people dressing in ways that has been traditionally identified as being Black, people who are racialized as white taking on African-American vernacular, the so-called Ebonics, those things. We're seeing cross-cultural exchange. But the biraciality part of that is a group that is, it's an identity that in some ways is left out of all that. For instance, I put up something in one of our previous 8 Black Hands that showed the number of children's story books that have a main character who is a person of color. And in one version of that, I think it was 2015, 16, and they've been putting it out every year. Like something like 70 something, 80, almost 80% of the main characters were white characters. The second group of characters were animals or inanimate objects like dump trucks and stuff like that. So children's books in the main, in the law of large numbers, if you were buying children's books, you had white characters that were about 80% of it, 70 something percent maybe. And then you had bears and animals and trucks that were like came in number 2. And then from there, you had much smaller populations of Black, Asian, Latino, almost no Native American and Indigenous American characters in children's books, and very little with the mixed race. So now if you're a mixed race parent looking for literature or for shows, TV shows, or for things that affirm the identity of the children you're trying to raise as being an identity that is normal amongst all others, normalized amongst all others, you have, I think, an additional layer of issue to get to. You have the very white books. You have the books that steer very Black. You have some books that are for Spanish language speakers, or like Dora the Explorer and Diego, but they all take it like an extra length, like, you know, like some of the Latino books get extra Latino, and some of the Black books get extra Black, and some of the white books remain extra white. So there's really this like netherworld, and you have to, as a parent, construct for your kids the tools that give them an identity, help them form their identity. It's tough, and schools are not your friend, in my estimation, when it comes to this. Not Black schools, not white schools, not so-called integrated schools. None of those schools actually, I think, have caught up with families and where we are right now on this. Anyways, I want to put, stop for a second and look at some of what you guys have in the comments. So Michelle Johnson says, Black as a social construction is a mark of inferiority. Black as race is acted upon us. African ancestors in America were called Black to mark them as less than. All right. So what I would ask you, Michelle, about that is, what about the references to Black prior to American or transatlantic slavery? Because Africans themselves describing Black skin or darkness in a fashion that wasn't inferior, but in a fashion that was superior, predates, I think. And I'm working on some quick like recall in my own memory. Like in books like Black Athena and in some of the prehistory books, you see a lot of like use of Black as being a positive, not a negative. And the colonials, I think, switched that around. So Cameron Lewis says, Tiger was being interviewed by Ebony magazine. The supporters of Ebony took his remarks as a rejection of Black identity when the magazine was trying to embrace him. And I think that, kind of is partially my recollection, in that he was really like trying to say that he was recognizing all the parts of his family, and that he wasn't going to like pick one over the other, which is oftentimes what multiracial and biracial people are asked to do. Well, no matter what you could have as my kids do, an entire German family. And by German, I mean people who are literally here only one generation from Germany, who act in ways and live in ways and speak in ways and eat, drink, and live in ways that are completely different than how I grew up. Now, that's not my heritage. That's not my family, but it is my kids, part of my kids' heritage and their identity. And they go back and forth between us. I could never imagine trying to sell them on the idea that wasn't them, like that half of their family, that way of seeing life or whatever, even though it's not mine. So I have to be very careful about when I'm thinking about my parental approach. I have to be very careful about them identifying and growing as who they actually are based upon their families, their heritage, and their lineage. That's different than mine. So mine is different than it's a part. Mine is a part of theirs, but it's not entirely what is there. Michelle Johnson also said, we need to get back to that. We need to erase the American construction of Blackness, the Jefferson construction. Man, now that's deep. When you bring Jefferson into it. So, wow. Michelle, you just done blown up my mind now. So when you bring Jefferson into it, he's an interesting character in American history, and his issues of race are really interesting. So he obviously marries up and marries white, and very white, which is what you would expect for the time, right? Like, and then he writes something called the Notes on Virginia. And in the Notes on Virginia, he has a very clear kind of passage that's like pseudoscience on why Blacks are inferior and why they will never live up to whiteness and white supremacy. And in that, he talks about how he talks about the skin. First of all, it talks about the skin as being monotonous. Like the blackness of skin is monotonous because it doesn't allow for a full range of expression, like the way that white people can blush and the way that they turn red when they feel certain affections and blah, blah, blah. And he uses that as a way to say that nature has made Black people less humorous, less expressive, less passionate in the loving sense, and really just kind of crude like animals. And then he actually literally, the president that many of you go to schools named after, literally compares Black people to monkeys and animals. And don't give me the, well, he just did that because that was a sign of the times. That's what everybody did. No, it's not. It's just not, right? And there were people that disagreed with him on this, and he was this person who thought a lot. But at the same time, he had Sally Hemings. So he had Sally Hemings. First of all, was underage, and so there's problems. This is a problematic story. Sally Hemings had a room adjacent to his, and she was a multiracial, biracial, a person, quite possibly the offspring of his father-in-law. And he had no problem carrying on a long relationship with her that produced multiple children in a way that wasn't like full loving relationship, and at the same time wasn't the slave master relationship. It existed somewhere in between with some problems. Again, come at me, folks. I'm only saying the history that I know, so put it in here. Come at me with any corrections on what I'm saying. I guess my only point in bringing that up is how old and how long America has had this biracial category, multiracial category, and has had a interesting set of rules that differentiated between white, Black, the in between, what we call mixed identity, which, I don't think people are mixed, but biracial identity, which eventually became the tragic mulatto thing. You have people like Lena Horne and Diane Carroll and others that I think went through this kind of periods of, light skin privilege in the Black community, but still not making it fully to white in the white community. So this is old, it's not new. And I think all this is interesting discussion. It's interesting to bring it up as a cultural topic, but I'm getting back to like where the rubber hits the road. When you're talking about children, all kids need to be developed intellectually, physically, spiritually, and they all deserve a development that fits who they are. That is what I often talk about, a humane education. A humane education to me is fitting for the person who is being educated. We have to stop thinking of education in terms of schools and buildings and pensions and teachers and rules and bells and classes and subjects. That's all system-centric thinking. Education is about the unlocking of the potential of each individual, every individual, all individuals, everyone. Not a single one is born without a need for self-actualizing. So how can you help people self-actualize when you don't even recognize their self? Like when you don't even statistically count their self, for instance, or you don't think through what does it mean if you have a Filipino and Black child? What are their cultural references that they have within their home that are going to be the scaffolding that you're going to build upon to help them self-actualize through your education and through your schooling? If you are completely denying their identities or attempting to force them into a monoracial identity, you can't possibly be an educator. You can't possibly be an education institution. You may be a school. You may be a school system, but you can't possibly be an educator in the sense that you are looking to help each individual gain what they need in their growing years to be a healthy, well-adjusted adult in their later years. Am I wrong, people? Help me here, come out. Because if I'm going wrong, let me know. Educator Barnes says you're preaching, Chris. So I'm going to take that. I'm going to take it that what I'm saying is not completely wrong. Ray, I know you in here. I don't know what you're saying. I can see your name popping up. I'm almost afraid to look to see what you're saying. Joshua Israel Stewart, who is a person that I know, interestingly enough, for this conversation that we're having today, says that there's a rapper named Mulatto. I've seen that once or twice. I'm too old to know everybody, but I've seen her pop up in a couple of places and just thought to myself, what a weird kind of like, I don't know. Listen, if that is her identity, then fine. Because that's the whole point of what I'm saying to you today, is that your identity matters. The author of your identity is you. Parents who have children that don't have traditional identities have an extra job to do to help their children become fully actualized human beings, capable of standing their ground with whoever. This is one of the things I've always wanted for my kids. Knowing how I grew up and knowing how savage things can be in certain schools. Now, I went to schools that were all Black. I went to schools that were integrated, so-called integrated. And I went to at least one or two schools where they were very white, right? And I could see, like, remembering from a child standpoint, I could see how things get very savage, the way that kids talk and act about cliques and racial categories and who you're with. What I never wanted for any of my kids was for them to ever be in a situation where they had to conform, where their identity was one that they had to put in the back seat. And I can't say that job is over with. I can't say that we're always successful with that. I don't know if you have been watching me or following me, you may have seen maybe a year ago or more, I wrote a piece about one of my kids who had a group of white friends who, one, were making Hitler jokes and anti-Semitic jokes and Jew jokes, which to me is always the sign that, listen, I'm used to white, Black racism, but when you start getting into Jewish stuff is when I start knowing for a fact that, oh, you committed to white supremacy. You you really all there. But, and they wouldn't stop using the word nigger. I don't know how else to put it. I'm just gonna be straight up. And even when my son protested, they kept saying it, and it became an issue, and it became an issue amongst the parents. And, there was an apology here or there. There was a, let's just divide our kids in another situation. There was a sense that, for some of the people, it was, see, there they go again, always making something out of nothing. And then there was a little bit of social exiling after that all became an issue of my son. And it became a learning moment. Again, like, here we have come all this way in so many ways and places. Now, in these kids' mind, one of the kids said to my son, white people invented the word so we can say it. And, as a parent, you're having to ask yourself in those situations about, the places and the spaces you're putting your kids in. Like, this is a normal, traditional public school that they're in. They're all now going to be in 3 different schools because of their grade levels, but nothing fancy about it. We don't have a ton of choices where we live. And this is that extra layer that I was talking about, because as my kids process feedback like that from other people's children, people with monoracial identities, they're getting one set of information from people who are racialized as white. They're getting another set of information, and by information I mean like social interactions, ways of talking, ways of being. Another layer of information they're getting from people who are racialized as Black and Latino and Asian and so on, with a very large growing population of multiracial children who haven't all quite figured it out yet, right? So what I'm trying to do for my kids is to give them the skills to stand their ground, to fight the fight for their own identity in a way that's just fierce. You don't care what other people have to say about it. I hold the keys to who I am, what I am, or whatnot. Now, it has been interesting. I'll tell you about another situation with my daughter, who's my youngest. When she was younger, I don't know how old she would have been, but we talk about race in ways that are, I think, age appropriate with our kids. And it's always interesting to me, like the feedback that we get. So she was going through our family members in our immediate family, like just us, her siblings and mom and dad, identifying who was what. And it was just weird that she put us in different categories, right? And it was based upon, I think, phenotype, how much we tan in the summer, which we have different levels. In the summer, some of us in the one family tan more than others, and I think hair texture. And it was just really I was interested in how she was constructing the world and seeing it. Now, I know that conversation would drive monoracial people nuts on all sides, because in that way they would say, just tell them that they're this or they're that, and let it be. That's not the way we're doing this. That's not what I'm doing with my babies. You can do what you want with your kids and with your babies. I'm raising multiracial, free people who get to decide who they are and get to tell the world who they are, and get to take none of your crap. None of it. I don't care what side of the fence you're on. I don't care how you identify. I am open to however you identify. I'm open to how you see the world. I'm even open to your critique of me in this way. And this is part of the critique of me. Because I was racialized as Black and grew up as Black with Black parents and Black family, even with Creoles as a major cultural ethnicity. And I call it an ethnicity because I think it was very localized to Louisiana and very localized to New Orleans in ways that I don't think everybody is localized to their areas. Even as my particular worldview, culture, identification, way of being in the world, you will hear me talk in ways where you think I'm almost a Black nationalist. I believe we should have Black-run schools, Black-led schools. We should own our own education. And I wouldn't fault you at some point for thinking, well, wait a second now, how can you say all this Black stuff? First of all, you're light-skinned, which is some of Ray. I don't know if you're still in the headings here, but some of my 8 Black Hands co-hosts give me a hard time around the light-skinned thing and whatnot. And I laugh and I take it in stride because that's part of the culture that I grew up with, the whole light skin, dark skin thing, the whole, Prince and DeBarge and Switch. And in a lot of the movies, the main actor or the main love interest was always kind of light skinned or whatever. I grew up with that. I understand that that's what we do. Right. So, but if you are watching me over a period of time and you don't know that I have multiracial children, I wouldn't fault you or blame you for when you find out that my children are multiracial for starting to raise questions around, well, wait a second now. Like, how are you so Mr. Blackity Black, Black on this one hand and your family is multiracial, right? Like, and I get it. I mean, let me be real about when I say I get it. when I say I get it in the way that like I understand what your issue is with it, but I don't give a damn, right? Like I get uh, your problem, but you have to keep understanding what I keep saying to you, which is I believe that each person has a right to their identity, how they see fit, and in the way that they have collected the information about themselves and formed their identity. I believe that's, you know, up to each individual. I was racialized as Black. I grew up as Black. My family is Black. We have our history is Black and Creole. I want to keep saying that. My kids' identity is being formed in a different context, socially, geographically, racially, than mine was. I'm honoring that. I'm helping them develop into who they need to be so that they are self-sufficient, free people who don't allow other people to define them and don't look for their power in other people's stories, but find the power in their own stories. And I do believe that a multiracial identity is one to be proud of, depending on, you know, where you're like who you're drawing from in your families or whatnot. Everybody should be proud of their family and where they came from. Sherry Lucas Hall, what are you saying here? I don't like the way the light skin thing is used and manipulated in society. My youngest is lighter than anyone else in our immediate family. She has lots of comments about her skin tone. I think this is right. Like there's so much that goes into like, man, until you have a multiracial child, maybe you don't understand the amount of stock that people put into hair texture and eye color and skin tone, phenotype. Those things may not ring out to you as much. And I will say this much too, like as a father who has gone through multiple pregnancies, and I shouldn't say I went through multiple pregnancies because I've never been pregnant. Just a little point of fact for y'all that want to know about Chris. But there is a situation where you never know what you're going to get. Like, you know, I don't know how you were for those of you that have children, as you're like thinking about your kid that's coming before they come. If you have some kind of good idea about the range in which they will exist, you know, in terms of their look and their phenotype and all that type of stuff, I can just tell you that in every situation, mine was off, like largely off, and I'm okay with it. So I guess I agree with you, Sherry Lucas Hall, that that we need to pay attention to all the comments that our kids get. Regardless of whether it's multiracial or monoracial identity, they get lots of comments and they start processing those, and you don't know how they're processing those. Okay, Michelle Johnson says, Al B. Sure. Here we go again with the Al B. Sure thing. Swarthy enthusiast. That is a unique profile. I greatly respect the way you are raising your kids to self-identify. I appreciate that, Swarthy enthusiast. I appreciate it. It's not perfect. I didn't know. I didn't have proper training for raising multiracial children. I still don't have proper training for it. It's something that, you know, I'm a long ways into it now. Have been through a little bit of some years of thinking and whatever about it, but I'm still surprised by how much of I don't know about it. I feel like we're at the beginning in general as educationists, as people who believe in education, as parents. I think we're still in the real beginning of understanding what all this means. The research in preparing for this conversation I wanted to have today, because it's heavy on my mind, because I'm always questioning myself about whether or not I'm doing enough to block and tackle and make sure that I'm not putting my kids into overly Eurocentric situations, overly Afrocentricized situations where they're going to be otherized. As I'm thinking about that, I'm always having a struggle. I'm always struggling about it. I'm always, so even in preparing for today, looking at the research around this, the research is so shoddy. And by shoddy, I don't mean that it's bad research. I just mean that there's too little of it. The research is really thin on the educational existence of multiracial children. There have been a few things that I've seen reported, like I'll pull something up for you guys right now that I thought was interesting in Hechinger report. So Hechinger report had this written by Andre Perry a while back, and it basically found that multiracial high schoolers have no test score gaps with whites. And what I thought was interesting about this is that there was a statistic in here that I didn't know, and I'm probably not going to be able to find it quickly, but it basically said that typically multiracial students come from families that are at, or I want to say like $45,000 a year less in income, or a substantially less amount in income than white students are. But there's no real, here it is. Multiracial students typically come from families that earn about $45,000 less per year than their white counterparts, but they make about $14,000 more than Black parents. So they're in this in-between spot, but seriously much less than white families. And yet the academic outcomes, according to this particular story, is that there's no test score gap between them and white students. Now, I just want to say this isn't the final word. This is one study that I read. In other studies, there's a lot more context to be put on this, because when you average people, the average multiracial student, you miss a whole bunch of other contexts in which these students are. For instance, there is a group of multiracial students that are much more likely to be in well-resourced white schools than Black students are, for a lot of reasons. If you were looking at that group of multiracial students, the gap would be smaller. Doesn't mean the gap is going to be smaller with multiracial students who are not in that situation. But again, what I'm calling for here is context, understanding, research, understanding the idea that that we have a population of students in our public schools who don't really make the front page of many of our debates. We talk about monoracial students often, the gaps between those students. We affirm the need to do better for those students. And I love the word affirm. We affirm them specifically by saying we need to do more to make sure that all students are doing, that the system is working equally well for all. It's got to be kind of the goal, right? So this is where I'm going to wrap this and say, I'm raising a family and raising kids that I don't often have this conversation with you all about, and I don't often talk about it in this way, but it is my story and it is my family. And I am only an activist because I have kids. I'm only an education activist specifically because I became a dad at 22 and decided, somewhere along the line that I wasn't going to stop like fighting and stop investigating and stop learning. And in that particular case, my activism was around a student who was my child, a student who was multiracial. So I don't think you ever really get that part of my story. And I wouldn't blame you. If you listen to my talk track, I'm often talking like I grew up studying and being curious about Black history, about Black politics, sociology, and what it will take to literally free Black people. So I wouldn't blame you if you didn't understand this other context in my story, but now you do. Now we've had an hour together and we've got to talk about it a little bit. I want schools to stop seeing multiracial students as, seeing is the wrong word. I want them to start seeing multiracial students as a population with unique needs that need to be affirmed and addressed through their schools. I need them to develop a pedagogy around it. I need teachers to be aware of the fact, especially with the high number of, listen, when my kids do something now, when it involves inviting other kids, the number of multiracial students that end up in their lives or whatnot is growing, and it's pretty profound, right? So to have this many biracial, multiracial kids means that you no longer can get away with not having some understanding, and every teacher should have some understanding of who they're teaching. And I think they're just catching up on Black students and Latina students. But this is a population that I think you're going to have to learn. You have to learn how to teach them, how to work with them. And finally, last idea here, or last thought. Black people, white people, brown people. When it comes to my children, you all could be part of the problem, right? And I just need to be honest with you about that. And I don't care who it hurts, who it offends, or whatnot. These are my children. I can't give a damn whether you like what I'm saying or not. I am saying to you, you can all be part of the solution, or you can all be a part of the problem. And progress is going to come whether you like it or not. It's going to happen. My kids are here right now, and my job is to ruthlessly fight for their development. And their development requires, when you talk about cultural relevant pedagogy, or culturally affirming pedagogy, or culturally competent pedagogy, I guarantee you're not talking about my kids. I guarantee it. As woke as you want to be, as liberal as you want to be, as equity minded as you want to be, you have affirmed every identity but my kid's identity. And I can see that because there is a history month. There is a week, a day for all these different identities. Let's count them up. Someone do an audit of your schools, and look at all the identities that they affirm throughout the year in 1 week or day or month throughout the year. Women's History Month, Latino History Month, LGBTQ plus month or week or day, depending on what your school district does, straight gay alliances. There's all these identities that they affirm. When's the multiracial kid day? When's that day come? What month is that? Is it August? Is there one? I don't think that there is. That's interesting. Why? Is it because statistically the number of kids just doesn't register enough? No, that's not it. Because you have identities that you're affirming that have a smaller population than the population of multiracial kids. Start seeing my kids. If you don't, expect a fight. I am Black. I identify as Black. My kids are multiracial in their identity. And they might identify monoracially or not, depending on how they form and how they grow. But you're going to hear from them and you're going to see them. As always, I thank you guys. This has been a very personal you and me conversation. I love it. No guest, no net, no wire, just a high wire, me and you. And I appreciate it if you show any degree of understanding for what this message was about today, because it's important. Of course, it's my family. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate the feedback that I see in the comments. I'm going to go back and read it all. I've only had a moment to kind of like glance over at it. I really appreciate y'all. I really appreciate you listening and you watching and you coming here and us having this time in this space. Tomorrow we'll be back with what I think is another great show with Matthew Ladner from Arizona. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the nation can learn from Arizona in terms of their choice model, their school choice model, and what families of all different kinds of backgrounds are getting out of the Arizona system that might be good for the rest of the country to study. As always, have a great day. Hope this starts out your week. May the peace of the Lord